Tonight we're in Aylesbury. Welcome to Question Time. On our panel tonight, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Conservative backbencher and leader of a group of pro-Brexit MPs at Westminster. Labour MP and former member of the Shadow Cabinet, Nandy. Grace Blakeley, economic commentator at The New Statesman. Self-described right-leaning but well-meaning comedian and Brexit supporter, Geoff Norcott. And here with everything you ever wanted to know, the founder of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales. Welcome to our panel, to our audience here, and of course to all of you at home. Join in the conversation. You can argue along using hashtag BBCQT on Twitter and Facebook, and of course on Instagram. Let's have our first question tonight, which is from Sarah Green.
Hi there. Should the schoolgirl from Bethnal Green who joined ISIS be allowed to return into the UK?
So this is of course, Shamina Begum, who's been all over the news today, 19-year-old pregnant, heavily pregnant young woman. She left the UK as a schoolgirl. She was a schoolgirl in Bethnal Green. There were 3 of them that left together to join Islamic State group in 2015, and she was just 15 then. And she has said she wants to come back and she wants to have her baby here. And it's caused some controversy. Lisa?
So I think the government has broadly struck the right balance here. She's a British citizen, she's entitled to come back to Britain, but as a British citizen, she's also subject to the laws in the UK and can expect to be investigated at least and possibly prosecuted too. But it seems to me we should be asking a much more fundamental question here. How is it that right under our very nose, 15-year-old school children from parts of Britain are being targeted, groomed and radicalised by groups as awful and threatening to our democracy as ISIS? And it seems to me, having worked with a lot of young people in the voluntary sector before I came into Parliament, who were in a similar situation, that we are just not serious about how sophisticated these radicalist groups are and how good they are at convincing young people that there is a better life on offer elsewhere than is available to them in the UK. And it seems to me that we're still not taking that seriously. One of the first things that the coalition did in 2010 was to axe the funding to community groups and to local councils to try to provide positive messages and take on some of those messages of hate and work with those young people. Now, that project wasn't perfect. I saw problems with it myself, but the answer surely cannot be to dismantle those projects and then start to try and clean up the mess after it's happened. We have to get serious about this.
I mean, Geoff Norcott, looking at the comments that Shamima Begum has made, she says she doesn't regret going to Syria, and she talks about seeing her first severed head in a bin. It didn't faze her at all. She doesn't seem particularly repentant. I mean, she's a young woman. She's 19. Should she be allowed back into the country? What's your view?
Well, I think that it sticks in the core a bit, doesn't it? The fact that she's unrepentant. If you heard the interview itself, you know, there's on the one hand you can say that someone was 15 when they went out there, and, you know, we all did crazy things at 15, but mine was more in the realms of, you know, not telling my mum what time I was going to be home. It wasn't going to join, like, a barbarous regime. So there has to be a degree of agency in which you take responsibility for your own actions at any age. And it is sort of slightly strange sometimes when elements of the left that on the one hand are saying that 16 people are able to vote, but then on the other hand, at 16, you know, they didn't know what they were doing. So there's a certain inconsistency there. I think you've also got to be just a bit smart about it, right? I do think ultimately she's a British citizen. So, you know, you cannot look at these barbarous regimes and then change the law yourself just because you have a strong emotion, as much as you might feel that. And let's be honest, she will have a lot of information from her time out there. Let's be expedient. Yes, you can return to have your, you know, your child in Britain, but we want information, because the truth of it is, in saving her baby, we might be able to save many other babies, I suppose, and we need to perhaps be a bit, you know, level-headed in that respect.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, what's your view on this? I mean, you know, another way of looking at it, she was just 15, as you say, Geoff, when she went. She was very young. She may have been indoctrinated when she was there, and perhaps one should view the comment she's made in that light. Do you think she should be allowed back in?
Well, I agree with what you've said. I think we should look at the various different points of this. First of all, she's a British citizen, and she has no other citizenship, and therefore we are not entitled to make her stateless. That is a matter of international law. Then if she returns here, we should apply our law, and if she has broken our law, then that should be investigated. But she was 15. She was taken abroad. She went abroad, but she was under the age of consent. She was married within a few weeks of being taken abroad. She's had 2 children, babies that have died, and she's now expecting a 3rd child, and she's only 19.
Do you think...
We must have some human sympathy for somebody who has been abused. And therefore, yes, of course we're responsible for our actions. I greatly believe in individual responsibility as a political way of approaching life.
Do you think taxpayers' money should be spent on bringing her back?
Well, I think the original cause of her going abroad was that she was indoctrinated and then married under the age of consent. That is normally seen as abuse, and normally people in that position are a victim. When she comes back, we must, of course, ensure that this nation is safe if she has been radicalised and if she's intending to commit crimes. But we also must have some human sympathy for somebody who was a child when she went abroad.
Can I just, there's a couple of young women over there. Don't look too alarmed that I'm coming to you. I just want, because you're not that far off the age of Shamina Begum, what's your view on this?
Well, I personally think that whilst it is a horrible thing that's happened to this girl, we do need to consider what she's seen and what she can help tell us about what's going on over there.
And we're both 18, we're still younger than her, and although her original decision to go over there and when she was 15, that was terrible. She was a victim at that point because she was abused, married underage. But now she is 19, although she still might be a victim, an ongoing victim of that abuse, she still somehow does have a say in what's going on to her. And if the help is available to bring her out of that back in the UK and she's not willing to take that, then we've got to consider maybe she's too far gone.
Is there anyone here who thinks she shouldn't come back? Yes, Sarah, you asked the question originally.
Yeah, I actually do. I mean, I've got a 17-year-old son and a 15-year-old daughter. No, I mean, I know the radicalised, and these are girls that are very vulnerable, and fortunately my children aren't, but nobody could make my children do anything they didn't want to do. She voluntarily took herself there. She went across lots of countries to get there. She's there. She's very hardened by what she's seen. You said she's seen a severed head in a bin. I mean, for me, I'm, an adult, and that would petrify me, and that would horrify me. And yet she's hardened to it. She speaks very off the cuff about it. If she comes here, what's going to happen to her baby? Where is she going to go? Who's going to pay to look after her, the baby? It's taxpayers' money. She's gone and she's joined ISIS. It's not that she's gone and joined, the circus. It's horrifying for me.
Oh, sorry, Jimmy, of course.
Just say, if she had a second passport, then the question is completely different in a way. We don't.
If she had dual nationality.
If she had dual nationality, then it becomes a much more interesting question, because as Jacob pointed out, we don't really have a choice under international law. She's a UK citizen.
Whereas if she had dual nationality,
if she had dual nationality, we should revoke her passport.
We could say she's no longer British and she can go to that other country.
I would fully support not bringing her back.
I do think it's interesting that when she left, she was widely perceived as a victim. And that is unsurprising. She was effectively brainwashed. She was a child. She was taken out and she was abused, as the panel have agreed that those things that happened to her are horrifying. She's now in a refugee camp. She's seen things that are deeply scarring and will have an impact on her for the rest of her life. And it isn't simply the case that she was a victim when she went out there. She turned 18 and the next day she's suddenly automatically completely and utterly responsible for what's happened to her. She's been raised in an environment. The wider issue here is the failure of the government's prevent agenda that's supposed to be finding these vulnerable people and supporting them to kind of engage in wider society and not kind of fall into these bubbles where they're brainwashed and end up, being taken out to get married when they're 15 years old.
Let's hear from the woman there, yes.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. No, I totally agree that she should not be allowed to come back in. I take your point, Jacob, that obviously she has been abused. But, You know, when you hear there's no remorse at all. And whilst obviously seeing 7 heads in bins, and she's heavily pregnant and she's lost 2 children, and she's obviously, you know, expecting a third, that was somebody else's child's head in that bin. And she's got absolutely no remorse whatsoever. I take the point that absolutely we would love to see and get that information from her to understand what she has seen out there. But I'm sorry, in my opinion, I pay my taxes, I do not want that woman coming back here and being rehomed when there are, you know, ex-forces people on the streets that need rehoming, and yet we're going to bring her back with open arms? No, I don't think so.
Hi. I actually agree with you. I don't think she should come back at all. As a teacher at school, we all had to go through prevent training. How has it helped? How has it helped? What message is this sending to other people who want to join IS? You know, if you're pregnant, you can come back. I think she shouldn't come back. She's made her choice. However old she is, she should not come back because it's sending the wrong message to other people who want to join and do the same thing and see more bins in heads and heads in bins. It doesn't work. It's not right. I just think she should come back.
What are back there in blue?
I'd like to know what the panel thinks if it was a boy. Yeah. A 15-year-old boy. I know he can't get pregnant, but let's say he was 19. He had a child there or a wife. How would you feel about him wanting to come back?
I think the same standards apply. If someone is a British citizen and not to bring them back to the UK would deprive them of of any nationality or statehood at all, then we've got to respect international law. They have a right to be here, but they're also subject to that law. And I would just say this as well to people in the audience saying, you know, don't want people here who are going to make us less safe. I really do understand that concern, but I don't think that we're any safer by allowing people who've been radicalised to continue to operate around the world without holding them to account. And I think actually one of the strongest messages you can send to other young people who are in a similar situation is that there are consequences for some of these actions. And the very fact that the very brave Times journalist has gone into that refugee camp and found this young woman and told this story, I think is one of the most powerful things that will actually speak to young people in many of those communities and help to counter these very stereotypical, very idealised forms of life that ISIS are pumping into our children, into our living rooms, into their bedrooms, through their smartphones, through their iPads on a daily basis. So I wouldn't for a minute think that by not taking this young woman back and applying British law that we're actually safer. In fact, if anything, I think it's the opposite.
Can I just ask, would it make a difference to anyone on the panel if it was a good point? Would it make a difference if it was a young man?
I think the general mood would be there'd be whatever sympathy currently exists, there'd be way less. Because there is, when you say, and people have used that language already this evening, she's a woman, she's a mother, she's got children, these are, you know, and in some senses rightly emotive things. And I think if it was a male person that had gone to fight for Islamic State, it wouldn't be quite such an issue. Like I say, I have a lot of sympathy with what the audience members are saying. That feeling I have, it's not about going to bring them back as well. The argument here isn't about that. The British government already said they're not going to bring them back. It's about
well, yes, the security minister said he's not going to put at risk British people's lives to go and look for terrorists or former terrorists in a failed state.
But you talk about a message, you know, and the message is, I think, is about, you don't fight a barbarous regime by changing your laws, I suppose, at a time where you find that something makes you feel uncomfortable. And there's another message, which is, you know, humanity. But it's such a difficult issue because you talk about vulnerability. What about the people that might be, all the people that might be at risk of terrorist attacks? Anybody that thinks there's a simple answer to this is kidding themselves.
Mm. Well, we shall find out what happens, no doubt, in the next months to come. I should tell you that Question Time comes from Chester next week, where we'll be joined by England footballing legend John Barnes. And the following week we're in London with Labour MP Chaka Amuna and by the novelist Lionel Shriver. And details of how to apply for the audience to join us here are on the screen, and I'll give them again at the end. Let's move on to another question. Carolyn Ruth.
The question I'd like to ask is that Brexit plans don't appear to be any further forward. Have the British people been let down by politicians who are pursuing their own agendas?
Yeah.
there seems to be a fair bit of support for that view in the audience. And obviously today the government were defeated on their motion supporting their Brexit strategy by 45 votes. I mean, Jacob, I think I might come to you first. I mean,
I wonder why.
I wonder why. I mean, Richard Harrington, the business minister, said this evening that the European Research Group, of which of course you are the leading light, is better suited to Nigel Farage's new party. And he said, in his view, you are not Conservatives. That is what he said to the House magazine this evening. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it's helpful to get into what one MP has said about another MP. I think it's better to deal with the lady's question.
Well, in terms of splitting the party or following individual agendas, that is exactly the question, isn't it?
Well,
you're following the ERG agenda, which is not the Conservative Party's agenda.
I stood on the same manifesto as Mr Harrington, and we said we would leave the European Union, we would leave the single market, and we would leave the customs union. That is what I'm trying to ensure that we do. Now, I have here the full text of the withdrawal agreement, all nearly 600 pages of it.
Who wants to take a look, folks? Come on. Make this your Valentine's night reading.
Absolutely. I've marked key pages of it, which I won't read out because there probably isn't time. But that explains why this is failing to deliver on the vote of 2016. People voted to leave, they didn't vote for a deal. This deal leaves us potentially tied into a customs union indefinitely, subject to the European Court of Justice in certain areas potentially indefinitely, and splits up the United Kingdom between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This is not a question of people like me letting you down. It is of the government having come up with a deal that does not deliver on the manifesto of 2017 or the referendum of 2016.
But in terms of pursuing individual agendas, I mean, you've got Liam Fox talking about or the ERG's ideological purity. I mean, the ERG is a minority in the Conservative Party. Are you in danger of holding the Conservative Party to ransom?
No, it's not a question of holding the Conservative Party or the country to ransom. I think we represent the bulk of the Conservative Party membership. But you have to remember that most MPs voted to remain, whereas the country voted to leave. And therefore, in Parliament, there is a disconnect between what people voted for and members of Parliament. But we are willing to compromise. That's the whole purpose of the Malthouse Compromise. There are bits in that I greatly dislike, paying £39 billion without getting anything clearly in return. But the reason I'm willing to accept it is I think it would be better to leave with a deal rather than without a deal, that it is important that everything that is then left would be time limited, so we would be completely free, we would not be the vassal state for an indefinite period, and that I hope it could bring the country together, because if I can compromise, people like Nicky Morgan on the other side of the argument have been able to compromise too. So it's untrue to say the ERG is holding people to ransom. We're sticking up for what people voted for. And fundamentally, I believe you should trust the people and deliver on manifesto commitments and referendum results.
Lisa, you were shaking your head, not surprisingly, throughout that.
Well, I think Jacob summed it up quite well at the end there when he said, I'm willing to compromise. If I can compromise with Nicky Morgan on the other wing of the Conservative Party, then what's the problem? Because this is the problem. We've got an ongoing tug of war between two wings of the Conservative Party who are not willing to make realistic compromises in the interests of the country. You can talk about the Malthouse plan, Jacob, but you know for a fact that that is dead in the water and will not pass. The EU has already ruled it out. So what we've seen from the very beginning is the Tory party putting their own interests over the country, not willing to reach out, not willing to listen. And as a consequence, I think that we are heading in this country, not just for no deal with the EU in 6 weeks' time, but I think we're heading for an unplanned no deal with the EU. And what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means right now, before you even get into an argument about what is going to happen in 6 weeks' time. A mum comes up to me at the train station in Wigan a few weeks ago and says to me, I've got a little boy with a life-limiting degenerative illness whose medication comes from the European Union. Can I be certain that I'm going to be able to get that medication in 6 weeks' time? I wrote to the government minister. He wrote back and said, well, we don't know, but we're doing what we can. What sort of government cannot tell that mother that in 6 weeks' time she will be able to access medication that prolongs and potentially keeps alive her little boy. And that is the situation that the Tory party has driven us into, and that Jacob and his colleagues tonight stood in Parliament and abstained on the Prime Minister's motion because they said that they were relaxed about that scenario. Just seems to me this is a complete absence of leadership, and whatever you think about Brexit, the majority of members of Parliament now are trying to get a deal, but we are being held to ransom by this extreme wing of the Tory party, and the Prime Minister has to stand up to them, or she has to get out of the way, let somebody else take on that job who is going to lead us out of this crisis.
But Lisa, the question is about, have the British people been let down by politicians pursuing individual agendas? So let's talk about, we've talked about the ERG, let's talk about Labour for a minute. So you've got reports of up to 12 Labour MPs who could break away and form a new centrist party. You've got Labour MP Chris Leslie only today saying we're being played for fools by the leadership of the Labour Party.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of individual agendas going on there too.
I mean, it's absolutely right that the behaviour of some people on the other side of the debate absolutely mirrors this. So you've got one very small group of people in Parliament who are saying it's got to be a second referendum and reverse the result, or I'm not listening and I'm not talking. And then you've got another group of people on Jacob's wing who are saying it's got to be what I consider to be an ideologically pure form of Brexit, which suits my interests, or I'm not playing and I'm not talking. Well, the rest of us in the middle have been talking.
So where do you stand then, Lisa?
I've been talking to government ministers. I've been sat behind closed doors with the Prime Minister. I've urged my own party to go into those talks.
Are you more
and
with
I've
the
urged
leadership?
my own party to drop their red lines, which we have.
Or what about these MPs who are breaking away? Where do you stand? Are you ultimately, if push comes to shove, and it's May's deal or no deal, would you go for May's deal? Are you supporting the leadership, or what about these 12 Labour MPs reportedly want to break away? Would you go with them?
Well, I'm exactly where the Labour Party was back in 2017 when we stood on a manifesto that said that Labour respects the result of the referendum, but we want to make sure that we have a trade deal that protects huge numbers of manufacturing jobs in constituencies like mine, because people can't simply afford to lose them. And ever since that date, I've been urging other parts of Parliament to come together and compromise, and we've finally got to a position where it is becoming increasingly clear that not only does Parliament want to stop no deal, but there would be a route through for the Prime Minister if she would agree to membership of a customs union, to protect workers' rights, to protect those jobs, and she would find support in Parliament. But she won't. Why? Because she's putting party before country.
There's lots of hands up. The woman in the maroon jumper.
Hi. I run a chemical company in Aylesbury. Over the past 30 years, we've grown from nothing to a medium-sized company, employing people here, buying products from all over the world, bringing them into the UK and selling them in the UK and in Europe. Because of the trade barriers that are being put up by Brexit and the duplicated regulations, the massively increased costs and bureaucracy of Brexit, we are having to now bypass the UK for half of our business. I don't want to do this. I want to employ people in the UK. I want to pay UK taxes and I want to support UK services. But because of people like the ERG and their hardline Brexiteer stance, I'm having to do this, and we're not alone. There are thousands of other companies in the UK doing this too. And we're all going to lose employment, taxes, our overstretched and underfunded public services are going to suffer. And when that happens, it's not going to be the Rees-Moggs and the Johnsons that are going to suffer from that. It's going to be us, the working people of the UK. And any Brexit deal is going to be worse than what we've already got. The worst case scenario is a no-deal Brexit, which would be catastrophic. And the Brexiteers just don't seem to care, or they don't know actually what they're trying to do, because this is going to be massively damaging long-term for the UK. And I just think, as more and more things come out about the Leave campaign, the promises of the Leave campaign are not going to be met by Brexit, by any Brexit. They were completely unrealistic. And also, we now know that Leave campaign used lies, illegal methods to get the result they got. So I just don't see how any of this can be valid, and it's we that are going to suffer at the end of all of this, while the government and the opposition seem to be just fighting internally.
You don't know, you don't care. I mean, when you hear that, and that was certainly an impassioned plea,
yes.
Does that give you pause?
On the other hand, the leading figure in INEOS, major chemicals company, has written to the head of the European Union, to Monsieur Juncker, to say that the regulations that have come from the European Union have made investing in the EU, from his point of view, something that is not worth doing because the regulations are strangling business. The problem is that the European Union is a failed economic model.
But what do you say to that woman there?
What I say is that we are freeing ourselves from this failed economic model to have a better one where we are able to engage with the rest of the world rather than hiding behind the barriers that the EU feel protects it, but in fact have led to low economic growth. If you look at
it's all going to be okay for her in the end.
Well, chemical regulations under the REACH regulations, if you're registered with REACH, you are able to export into the European Union's market. So that is something that ought to continue. But we don't have the deal yet. It may be that we go to WTO terms, but the economic failure of Europe really is quite extraordinary. Since the Eurozone was set up, the Eurozone has grown by 26%, the UK by 44%, and the US by 42%. That gives you an idea of the failure of the central EU project, that we are going to be freeing ourselves so that we can be economically more successful. We can lower the prices of goods in this country by cutting tariffs. We can have cheaper food, clothing and footwear, benefiting most of all the least well-off in our society. This is a terrific benefit. So do I think industry will benefit in the end? Overwhelmingly. It will be good for competitiveness, good for British business.
Jimmy Wells.
Well, I think I'm actually the only pure Remainer here on the panel tonight. I think we should scrap the whole thing. It was a bad idea to start with. Let me go through a couple
There's clearly a few in the audience.
But I think here's the point. I think almost everyone in the room would agree that it's a bit of a train crash at the moment. It's not going well at all. And when we look at the most recent polling, people regretting the way the vote turned out, that Remain is ahead by 8 or 9%. If you ask people how they would vote today, Remain is ahead by 8 or 9%. The point is, this idea that we're carrying out the will of the British people is certainly evaporated. It is very unclear that this is what the majority want today. And so I think we do have to have another ask of the public. Now that they've seen what's on offer, they're not liking it. They're not liking it. I mean,
there's lots of people who don't agree with you, Jimmy.
Yes, of course. Of course, it's a difficult and contentious issue.
Can I just hear from someone who doesn't agree with Jimmy in the audience? Yes, this man in the front.
I don't believe that referendums will solve anything. If you have another one, it might be just as close, but the other way. Then we're back to square one. We've already had a referendum, and we've had a general election where both major parties stood on a manifesto where they said they're going to leave the European Union. We've got to accept it, even if you don't agree with it.
Grace, just bring you back to the original question. Yeah. So, the original question is, have the British people been let down by politicians pursuing individual agendas?
Yeah, and Carolyn's question was a very good one. And I do think that the British people have been let down by their government, who has been negotiating this process. This referendum came about as a result of splits within the Tory party, as a result of them bickering amongst themselves. We had the referendum campaign, and that was led by two campaigns that were both completely and utterly out of touch with just the trauma that many British people had been experiencing since the financial crisis, 10 years of wage stagnation, incredibly high levels of debt, an economy that just really isn't working for the vast majority of people. Remain went in and said, let's just keep everything the same because it's working just fine for us. And Leave said, take back control, we're going to kind of stick it to the elites, whereas actually just pursuing their own agenda. And I think the situation we're in today is one where what happens next in terms of how the government responds to the position that we're in, what the government does in order to push Brexit forward, is much more important than actually the nature of the exit itself. Government policy now and after the vote in terms of what they're going to do with the economy, whether or not we're going to have a stimulus programme that will absorb the impacts of this, or whether or not we're just going to slash taxes, slash regulation, turn Britain into this bargain basement model of the coast of Europe, which is basically a tax haven, which is what people like Jacob seem to want. Or actually whether or not we're going to use this as an opportunity to build a new kind of economy, in a global economy that has fundamentally changed, and also taking into account the climate imperative. We have 12 years to green our growth, and this would be an amazing opportunity to do something like a Green New Deal that would both absorb the impact of the shock initially and also transform the nature of economic growth over the long term, which is not working for anyone.
I think, quickly, there's such fantasy land thinking on both sides here. I mean, Jacob imagines and hopes for a low-tax, free market utopia You're hoping for some sort of a socialist utopia now that we're free from the capitalism of Europe. Neither of you is going to get what you want, regardless of what happens here.
But Jimmy, neither are you. I mean, the truth is that we had a referendum, and you know, whether you like it or not, and frankly, I didn't. I voted and campaigned to remain. But a lot of people came out, contrary to what we've been told. They weren't stupid. They weren't racist. They thought hard, and they voted the way that they did. And now we've got a really difficult job because we've still got a very divided country, and we've got to find a way to heal and come together and move forwards. And just reopening these old conversations about the referendum result is not going to enable us to do that, and it's not going to protect businesses like that lady's over there in the audience.
Geoff?
Well, you know, we're all arguing now. It's starting to feel like Valentine's night. So this is what I came out for.
Worst one ever. Welcome to the party, Geoff.
I think it's interesting when we talk about being let down by politicians. We always seem to talk about Tories, we talk about Labour, we talk about May, we talk about Corbyn. We never talk about the EU. You know, I thought Andrew Marr made a really interesting point about the fact that senior EU politicians, they never come and talk to us, do they? You know, they claim to represent us. They claim that they're so sad to be leaving Britain. They quote Beatles lyrics at us. But they never come and... We love a chat. Right? So I'd say to Donald Tusk, you know, you talk about special places in hell, right? But he seems to prefer a special place in his air-conditioned boardroom than actually getting out and meeting the people. Because I tell you something, coming on this is terrifying, right? But it's exhilarating, and people admire anybody that comes on it that actually has the balls to do it. Maybe he doesn't have them, right? Maybe he doesn't have the stones to stand up here. I've gone further than I meant to on this point.
Yeah, I'm wondering where it's going to go, Geoff. The man there in the blue sweater.
I think it's unfair to point the finger at specific MPs for the current standoff we have in Parliament. The problem we have is the electoral system we have in place, which gives us two parties. Each party cannot just follow one voice. Each party is actually a coalition of different voices. And if we didn't have people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, then a certain section of the society will not be represented. Although I disagree with him in certain places, but he does have value in voicing these...
That's good to know, isn't it? That's good to know. Not is that damning with faint praise, I'm not sure.
But can I come back on...
briefly, because I need to get to hear some more from the
Mr Wells' very important point that he thinks Grace and I are putting forward ideas that are for the birds. The great thing is it's a democracy, and I will stand for one thing, and Grace for another. And you, ladies and gentlemen, can vote for which you want to have, and the EU won't be able to tell us which it is going to be. That's why it's so exciting to have voted to leave. I hope you won't vote for Grace, I hope you'll vote for me. But that will be your choice.
I'm not announcing anything today.
Jumping out of an airplane with no parachute is also very exciting.
The woman in the striped shirt.
Fiona. I think the thing that we keep coming back to is that there's two parties. Now, I'm a Remainer. Some of my family are Brexit. What I don't understand is why we didn't have a bipartisan agreement that we moved forward together as a country post the vote. I didn't agree with it. I don't want to leave. However, I agree in democracy. Why are we not coming together as a bipartisan vote and going forward? This is the thing that I think lots of people and lots of my friends are actually really frustrated. Yeah. Why is it little parties? Why can't we move forward as a country?
Man there.
The parties can come together as much as they want. The EU are giving us absolutely nothing, so we can prolong this as long as you want. They're going to give us nothing. Why don't we start optimistically looking towards the future and a brighter one out of the EU?
We've had a lot of questions tonight, so I'm going to move on. But before I do, it being Valentine's night and all, I just want to say that the Malthouse Compromise that you support and that you think is dead in the water, Kit Malthouse, the Conservative from whom this came, said, if I'm lucky, the Malthouse Compromise might go down as a small footnote in the history of Brexit. If I'm not, it'll end up as a name given to an obscure sexual position. So there's something to conjure with, folks. Samantha North.
Hi. Considering the ever-increasing estimated cost, is it now time to scrap HS2?
Well, that got a very loud cheer from quite a lot of you. I'm sure there's people who don't agree with that view, but... Me. I'll come to you in a minute there, sir. Geoff?
I mean, it's almost like they're planning to run the line through Aylesbury, isn't it?
It's going to come. It's going to run through a mile from the centre of Aylesbury, isn't it?
But it's not going to stop it, right? And that's why you're angry. I googled HS2 Aylesbury house prices. That's the first thing that comes up on the Google searches. Look, I know you've got legitimate worries about it, and I think that, I mean, in terms of HS2, one of the problems, it's not a very sexy idea, is it? Something that it's not reinventing the wheel, is it? It's just giving it a better set of tyres.
Well, it's projected to shorten the journey from London to Birmingham by 32 minutes and London to Manchester an hour. No? OK, we'll hear from the audience in a minute. That's the information I've had.
I do think, you know, despite being a Londoner, there has to be some sort of effort to rebalance this sort of London-centric economy that we have. You have to link up things better. You have to be able to do business. And also think it will be... I think it would be good for the economy, the infrastructure and the jobs it will bring. The big question is it deliverable, I think? You know, you ask for HS2, you might end up with HS 1.2. This might be the worst sequel in history. So sometimes you have to do these kind of projects to test what, you know, a country is capable of, but sometimes it might prove what you're not capable of.
We definitely need to link up the country, right? That's absolutely true. You know, we have, like, terrible infrastructure in this country, particularly transport infrastructure, and that's partly been because the government has point-blank refused to invest any money in our transport infrastructure that's deeply necessary for economic growth over the last 10 years on the basis that we can't afford it, even though actually that will expand our economy and our tax revenues over the longer term. But the problem is that all the money that is spent is focused mainly on London, and actually linking up London with Birmingham, two big cities that actually have, you know, they have devolved governments that are able to kind of spend some money there. And the bigger problem that we have is connectivity between east and west in the UK and between the nation's regions. We are the most regionally unbalanced country in the EU. London is this huge, you know, black hole that sucks in investment, people, everything else from the rest of the country. And actually what we really need is, you know, to invest in our infrastructure as part of a coherent industrial strategy to rebalance our economy away from London and away from finance.
Jimmy?
Yeah, I did some research. I did the same Google search you did. And I thought, well, it's going to be amazing for Aylesbury. It's only 20 minutes to London from here. And then I saw, oh, but there's no stop here. I think if they're building it, I don't understand. There's 14 trains an hour. Couldn't 2 of those be kind of slower and locals and stop at many places along the way?
But that then defeats the purpose of HS2, which is a high-speed rail link. I mean, that's what it's designed to do.
Do 10 an hour that go, you know, the express ones, and do some that are designed to stop at different places so that other smaller communities get the benefit.
Woman there in the pink sweater.
Just to correct you, we've heard in the media recently that the trains are going to go slower so that they can save money, and they're not going to be so frequent. We already have a very good service here in Chiltern Line. It stops at stations, we can get on it here, without having to go into London. And if anyone saw the dispatches programme last week and realised the terrible time people have from Manchester round on their trains, the money should go up there. It shouldn't be delivered down here.
The woman in the blue coat.
Rather than building another train line to connect two places that are already connected by a train line, wouldn't it be better to connect places that aren't already connected by train lines, like Milton Keynes and Aylesbury and Oxford? Those are just examples, obviously, but there must be examples like that all over the country. And wouldn't that make more sense? Because, you know, there are a lot of journeys that, like, you live somewhere like this, and if you're going into London, you can go on the train. But if you're going almost anywhere else, you have to go by car or bus because there are no trains going in other directions.
A woman at the front here.
It said that the HS2 is already overspent, just like the Garden Bridge that was overspent has been scrapped as well. And Northern Powerhouse is supposed to be less to actually build it and give back more economically. This is what's being reported in dispatches. So why are we doing it when we've got so many things in public funding that we need to spend money on? It could be diverted.
Now, you, sir, shouted out that you support HS2, I think.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Oh, my goodness. OK, hang on a minute.
Oh, no,
is there
I want to get out
anyone
of here
here?
alive.
Well, what is your view, then?
My view is HS2 is a white elephant. That money could be so much better spent, as said there, different lines, different places in the country. It's just an absolute white elephant. The train station is outside Birmingham. You then have to go into Birmingham, you have to get another train. So where's the time saved? Most people, the argument was you can get to London quicker so you can do more work and you're more productive. Most people do work on their computer. Just do Wi-Fi along the whole system.
Can I
There's
ask,
so many easy answers.
Is there anyone in the audience who supports HS2? All the hands have gone down. Literally nobody. Yes. Let's have you again, sir, then. Go on. You're the only person who's put their hand up.
Well, basically, I live in Milton Keynes. It doesn't affect me.
This final we're about to break out when we're discussing Brexit, but they are 100% unified as a country.
Go on, so what have you got to say?
From a national perspective, it's a good project to have. It will connect the countries and make it smaller, more reachable from different places. There's a lot. I used to live in Aylesbury. I used to live in Aylesbury. There's a lot of NIMBYism around, I have to say, and it's just the and
do the train stations in the north first.
Yes. Hang on. Let's let the man finish his point.
Sorry, just last point. And in certain areas in the south of the Aylesbury Vale, some Conservative MPs have managed to get concessions from the government to have parts of the HS2 tracks within tunnels, so they can keep their majority within their seats. So it's not all gloom in this area. I mean, there are certain concessions which have been some MPs have managed to gain.
Jacob, David Davis, I think today was describing it as a white elephant. Your view?
Oh, it's a complete waste of money, and the cost goes up and up. Dare I say, North East Somerset's some way from HS2, so I can't be accused of being a NIMBY. I just believe government money should be spent well. And there was a brilliant report by a former chairman of British Airways when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister that said there were thousands of small projects you should do across the country in various forms of transport that got rid of bottlenecks. Not one of them being enormously expensive, not one of them likely to bear the name of a politician who had set it up, but that each one would have improved people's travel times and standard of living and daily life. That's what I would like to see happen. As it happens, a couple of these things have taken place in my own constituency. Little pinch points and junctions that have been widened, and suddenly they flow and they cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, not hundreds of millions, into £100 billion. I'm not purely saying this to suck up to this brilliant audience, but I would scrap HS2 immediately and not worry about the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is that once you've spent a couple of £1 billion, you have to keep on spending, otherwise you've wasted the couple of billion. No, you save the 98 billion, and that is what we should do.
Got the investment that Jacob's talking about, it's because of austerity, because of the austerity agenda that he supports, because of the tax and spending cuts that he would like to see when we leave the European Union. Actually, what we need is masses of infrastructure investment in this economy. And, you know, we could do that by borrowing, which is very cheap, which makes it back over the longer term. This is an ideology that you fundamentally disagree with and that would see this country turned into a kind of, you know, bargain basement model with roads that lead to nowhere.
Can I make a very brief point on that? I always get a briefing from Central Office before these events, and they gave me the figure on how much had been spent on railway investing, which is a record figure. They then said to me, but half of that's on HS2, so it may not be so popular in Aylesbury. So the money is being spent, it's just not being spent the way you and I would like.
Lisa.
Well, first of all, can I thank those members of the audience who've shown this outbreak of North-South solidarity and spoken up for the crumbling services that we've got in the North. Look, I've always felt that we need better national infrastructure. I don't want to see us pose a choice between local, regional and national infrastructure. I think we can actually do all of those things. We're one of the richest countries in the world, and if the government can find large sums of money at short notice to try and buy off MPs about local train stations, or to try and target MPs like me to try in a vain attempt to attract our Brexit vote, then they can afford ongoing investment in our railways and our bus networks. The trouble for me with High Speed 2 is that it's become a complete mess, and I don't think anyone's really got any confidence that we're going to be able to sort it out. I mean, frankly, after a year of rail chaos in the North, I wouldn't trust Chris Grayling to run a BAF, let alone a national rail project. And The problem for me with this debate is that I cannot go back to my constituents and make the case for this level of investment in High Speed 2 when for a year people have been struggling just to simply get home on time to read their kids' bedtime stories. I've got young people who, because of the decimation of our bus services, which we never talk about in national politics, cannot take up apprenticeships that they've been offered. These are real-life consequences for people that are happening right now. And when all of this is over, I don't know whether High Speed 2 will continue in its current form or be scrapped, but when all this is over and there's the inevitable inquest into what happened, surely we have to understand that the answer isn't to take power from one group of people behind a desk in Whitehall and hand it to a different group. The answer has to be that the people who are making these decisions have to be people who know those areas, who visited those areas, who have actual skin in the game and use these services. No more of people hundreds of miles away making decisions, lines on a piece of paper that have profound consequences for our lives with absolutely no accountability for those decisions at all.
Let's take another question. Deepesh Tozan.
Thanks. Is Winston Churchill a hero or a villain?
Now, this, of course, comes about yesterday. You'll be well aware of this, Lisa. The Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell was asked a question where he could only give a one-word answer, hero or villain. He was asked that about Winston Churchill, and he said villain because of Churchill's actions during the Tony-Pandy miners' strike back in 1910 when soldiers were sent in, and there was at least one fatality during the miners' strike. Grace, what's your view?
Well, I can understand that Winston Churchill is close to people's hearts. He clearly played an incredibly important role, a leadership role, bringing the country together during a moment of national crisis, the kind of existential threat to the UK, and he made a series of very good decisions, and he stood up to fascism. What I would say is that, those actions should be applauded. But there are some of his actions which should not be applauded. And, we are a mature democracy. We should be able to look back at our history and say, not this is black and white, but there's some ambiguity. And, Winston Churchill, for example, in Afghanistan, waged a brutal campaign against the Pashtuns based on the fact that they needed to recognise the superiority of the race, our race. He was implicated in the genocide in Bengal that killed at least 3 million people. And in Kenya, for example, 150,000 people were put into concentration camps in what have been called Britain's gulags. He fought the Nazis, but he had very little issue with the concentration camps the British used in the Boer Wars. He said that he had no problem with gases being used against uncivilized tribes. These are all things that have no place. No one on this panel would be allowed to get away with advocating these measures or having these views. And we need to be able to look back and actually think clearly about whether or not that is someone that we want to turn into a hero. And even then, even without all of that, should we be looking at war and saying the man at the top who is making all the decisions is the one that we're saying is a hero?
But so would you call him a hero or a villain,
millions
Grace?
of people who died. I don't ascribe to this view that history is driven forward by great men, some of whom are heroes, some of whom are villains.
And it was the question, in fairness. What would you call it?
Well, I wouldn't have responded because it's a silly question. It's not wars.
Sorry, Deepesh. Sorry about that.
Not your question, Deepesh. The question that was asked to John McDonnell. Because who died in these wars? Who lost their lives, limbs, arms, legs, came back with really severe mental health problems? These were our ancestors who fought and died on those battlefields. They're the real heroes. They made the real sacrifices.
Let me just say that John McDonnell has added to his comments today and said that Churchill was obviously a hero during the Second World War. There was another side to Churchill, and then, of course, he referred to Tony-Pandy. Nicholas Soames, the Conservative MP and, of course, grandson of Churchill, said, "I think my grandfather's reputation could withstand a publicity-seeking assault from a third-rate Poundland Lenin." That was his view. Lisa.
So, with no...
Hero or villain?
With no disrespect to Deepesh, who's reflecting something that has consumed a lot of national debate in the last 24 hours, I really do think this is a stupid question, and I think this is why you're getting a stupid answer. And frankly, I'm sick to death of a political debate that tries to reduce things to yes or no good or bad.
But if it was a stupid question, he's the Shadow Chancellor. Why didn't he just knock it back like Grace did as a stupid question? He took the opportunity and we saw what he really thinks.
But he didn't see what he really thinks, because then he's been out this morning talking in real terms about the legacy of Winston Churchill. And look, this is really, really dangerous stuff. We've seen it with the Brexit debate, and we're seeing it with many of the conversations that we have in our political discourse at the moment. It is poisoning it. I happen to think, like probably most people in this country, that there are some decisions that Winston Churchill made that I wouldn't agree with at all. But at a critical moment in British history, he stood up and he made the right judgment call that has profound implications for all of us still now today. And what this daft debate that seeks to divide us has done is it's allowed people in British politics on Jacob's wing of the Tory party to try to invoke the spirit of Winston Churchill somehow, as if we're still in this war era, and as if we should still be engaged in war, and as if half of this country who voted differently in a referendum are engaged in battle. But for me, the thing that was so important about that decision that Churchill made was that he was a leader who led Europe. He led Britain in Europe to defeat fascism in a confident, outward-looking country, and he would have had no time for this sort of nonsense at all. He understood that there was complexity in the world, and so should we, frankly. We are letting people down with this level of political discourse.
Do you agree with that, Jacob?
I agree with the thought that confusing Brexit with the Second World War is silly. It isn't. But without Churchill, I've just been listening on an audiobook to Andrew Roberts' brilliant biography of Churchill, and the Second World War would not have been fought by us without Churchill, that everyone else in the British establishment was ready to seek peace terms. Halifax was keen to do it, Chamberlain was keen to do it. There was nobody else with the backbone, the determination, and the knowledge to stand up to Hitler. And that is perhaps the most important single event that this country has been involved in the last century. He is therefore a hero. I could quibble with some of Miss Blakeley's facts. I could argue, for instance, that the gases referred to are not gases in that sense. They are tear gas that was suggested for people who were rioting, still used today in civilized countries. May not be desirable, but it's not gassing people, which has been one of the slurs on Churchill's
reputation. And the
reputation.
superiority of the race, or the concentration camps, or the Kenyan gulags?
The concentration camps, the South African concentration camps had exactly the same mortality rate as existed in Glasgow at the time. So they're not a good thing, but where else were people going to live when there was all that war?
Did you just justify the use of concentration camps?
No, I didn't. I'm talking about the Boer War had people put in camps for their protection.
Where the British invented the use of concentration camps.
But I'm afraid you're confusing concentration camps with Hitler's extermination camps.
I'm not saying they're the same thing. I'm saying that any concentration camp is de facto an awful, awful thing.
These were people who were interned for their safety. Now, that is not a good thing. I'm not in favour.
Hundreds of thousands of people died.
The death rate was exactly the same as in Glasgow. Death rates 100 years ago were considerably higher than they are now for all sorts of reasons, including...
It was systematic murder.
It was not systematic murder. That's simply wrong. I'm not advocating people being taken off their farms and put into camps, but there was a war going on, and people were being taken there so they could be fed because the farmers were away fighting the Boer War. So this is one of the things where you've got to understand the history of what was going on, not just look at it from the comfort of 2019 and say that this is the same as what was going on with Hitler. It is completely and utterly different, simply wrong to lie to see.
Jimmy.
At least these two agree about Brexit, so there's that.
We certainly know.
I mean, I basically agree with the perspective that it's a stupid, political discourse should be nuanced, thoughtful, in-depth, fact-based. And I don't like, in the media and other places, a kind of a gotcha culture. Pose somebody a question knowing, that they're likely to answer in a certain way, or just to see if they will take one side or the other on something it's complicated and nuanced. So,
I suppose what...
And I do think, I agree also John McDonnell could have knocked back the question.
And that's the point, isn't it?
100%.
I know, but then you say you're not answering the questions. I mean, this is the problem, is that if you ask a stupid question, you get a stupid answer.
We don't have
and
to.
this is
Grace
not
didn't
a
answer
clever
it.
question.
Look, well,
I'm not a
and he
politician,
should have knocked
again.
it back. What happened was, I'm glad this happened in a way, because it was a reminder of who John McDonnell really is. We've had a strange little spell where you always get the sense when he's smart. There's nothing scarier than a John McDonnell smile, is there? I mean, you just get the sense.
I'm sure he
that,
doesn't think so.
No, he doesn't think so. No, I can respect who he is. I think we just need to be overt and clear about who he is. He's a very old-fashioned, hard-left socialist. Some would say a Marxist. He was asked he's been doing this rounds where he's gone and he's met big business and stuff, and he's been pressing flesh, and there've probably been some quite firm handshakes, I'd imagine. But he's been trying to change the perception of himself. But he was asked to throw his mind back, right? And that's what you've got to do when you're assessing Churchill. He went past somebody who stood tall against Hitler in 1940 and 41. He went past that and went to an undeniably contentious moment in history, but he chose to overlook that. I'd like to think that, Churchill was a complicated figure, but by the end of his life, defeating Hitler, you'd hope gives you something of a pass.
At least I have to ask you, did you agree with that description of John McDonnell?
No, I just think this is ridiculous. I mean, you're basically taking a question that was about Winston Churchill and whether he's a hero or a villain, and then trying to turn it into a question about whether John McDonnell's a hero or a villain. We've got to
we
stop
saw something
judging.
about him through his answer,
We've got to
did we
stop
not?
judging people in this ridiculous way.
No, I
just
don't
listen
mind
to
who
what
he is,
people are
but
saying.
I mind who he sometimes pretends to be.
No, come on. Listen to what people are saying. Understand the nuance. Understand the complexity. Let's stop trying to divide people into camps and turn each other against one another. There were certain things that John McDonnell said yesterday in answer to that question, particularly around what had happened with the miners' strike, that actually are incredibly important to people in those communities still today.
Didn't knock that back at all.
You know what? I agree with you absolutely on the assessment about Winston Churchill stepping up at this critical moment in history, but surely you've got to understand that these things matter too, and that history is complex and it's nuanced and it deserves a better debate than this.
Let's have the final. Dipesh, you asked the question. What's your view? Is this an oversimplification?
For the record, it wasn't my question. It was. I think I absolutely agree. I think it was a daft question. You can't boil this down to a sort of yes or no on that. And I think to label Churchill a villain is to deprive him of all the fantastic things he did. But I do absolutely think that there needs to be an open, honest, and not overly sensitive debate about the nastier side of Winston Churchill and his legacy, as we've seen. But I think the bigger point here is that, I think there is an element in our nation that we perhaps haven't quite grappled with and come to terms with our history in this sort of romanticised sort of view of the British Empire. I think, and especially at times like this with Brexit, where we are probably at one of the most significant moments in our history, it's really important to understand where we've come from, how we've got here, so that we can truly build a sort of national sense of identity and understand our place in the world and the future, which is incredibly important at times like this.
Amazing how, in my short period on Question Time, everything somehow works its way back to Brexit. I can't think why that is. Our hour is up. Next week we are in Chester, and the week after that we're in Catford in South London. You can call 0330 123 9988 if you'd like to be in the audience, or go to the Question Time website. You can follow the instructions there. And if you want to have your say on tonight's topics, as always, you can join Adrian, Charles and guests on Question Time Extra Time, and that's on 5 Live now. My thanks very much to our panel. You're taking a big sigh there. Sigh of relief. Our panel, our audience, and of course, you at home. From Aylesbury, bye-bye.
A fable for tomorrow over on BBC Sounds with Tina Dahili. Beyond Today will hopefully restore some faith. Download the app if you haven't already.